digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Andy Ewington, who returns to us once again, artist and comic book writer. We have with us also Paul Scanlon, CEO of Legion M, returns to us once again. And with us today we also have Ian Livingston. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello. Hi there.
Hello.
Thank you.
I wonder if, for the record, you could introduce yourselves and explain a little bit about what you get up to in your respective lives. I'm going to start with you, Andy, because you've got a lot of exciting things going on with Titan. And obviously, you also have a lot going on with 451. So why don't you tell us exactly what you're up to, young man?
Yep, I'm Andy Ewington. I'm a comic book creator, currently working with the legend, which is Ian Livingston, on his fighting fantasy title, Freeway Fighter, which has been picked up by Titan Publishing into a 4-issue miniseries, which will be released in May. Beyond that, I'm also working with Michael Bay at company 451 on a slew of titles that they're sort of sending out periodically, with the likes of George Pelecanos and Rob Cohen in the background.
Wonderful, thank you. And Paul, why don't you explain to our lovely listeners exactly what Legion M is all about?
Sure. So Legion M is the world's first fan-owned entertainment company. So we are using new securities laws that were just enacted last year in the U.S. to allow fans, not necessarily Wall Street investors, to co-own our studio with us as we go out and we get behind creators and producers that we like, and we help bring projects to market. Our long-term, we call it Legion M, and M with the bar over it, which is the Roman numeral for 1 million, because our long-term goal is to unite 1 million fans together to reshape and rethink and get Hollywood into a more creative groove.
Indeed.
And we opened up our first round last year, and it was hugely successful. And now we're about to open another round of investment in the next month.
It's very exciting times, and it's certainly the evolution of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. But Ian, living legend that you are, would you care to explain to us all of the wonderful, amazing things that you are up to?
Well, I'll try and summarize that. As I've been in the games industry over 40 years, which is quite a long time by anybody's imagination. So started back in 1975, co-founded Games Workshop with Steve Jackson. We launched Dungeons and Dragons in Europe, and subsequently the retail chain of Games Workshop, and of course Warhammer, Citadel Miniatures, White Dwarf, etc. We took the essence of role-playing and turned that into a game book format by creating the fighting fantasy concept, which were interactive books in which you are the hero. And it's the 35th anniversary this year, and I'm writing a new one to celebrate that event. It's going to be out in August with a new publisher, so that's very exciting. And there's been quite a resurgence in fighting fantasy. Those who grew up with the books in the 1980s have now got their own children, and they're looking to pass the baton on to them. Now, normally kids reject 100% whatever their parents think is cool, but I'm delighted to say they seem to be enjoying fighting fantasy. The interactive nature of a book is quite compelling because it gives control to the user, and kids of today are resonating with the books as they did back in the 80s. So that's very exciting. Of course, as a result of that, there's been quite a few merchandising inquiries and licensing inquiries, and I'm delighted to say that Fighting Fantasy Freeway Fighter is going to be coming out as a comic, as Andy was saying, and Andy's done a fantastic job in writing that. Of course, I've been very much associated with video games. I was executive chairman of IDOS from when we floated in the 90s up into the 2000s. Of course, IDOS best known for Tomb Raider and Hitman. And these days I also invest quite a lot in indie studios. I love the fact that independent studios can really move the art form quite a long way in video games and reach new audiences via super high-speed broadband and find new ways of playing, new ways of gamifying their content and evolving the art form. And it's great to see that games are a mass market entertainment medium today. Yeah, everyone's playing them. You see them coming out of their bedrooms and enjoying games on their mobile phones on public transport. So there's so much great things happening in games, and I've been delighted to be part of that for many years.
Well, I think we can all go home now.
Yeah. Wow.
But before
Good
we
to meet you.
before we go home, let's have this conversation. So I know that I've had this conversation with some of you before, but I kind of want to dig into this again, which is this kind of evolution, if you like, of the traditional form of storytelling, which was comic books and kind of on the written page, so to speak. And this evolution that we've been seeing of not just the kind of borrowing of comic book stories, characters, and universes into the movie and the film industries, but now we're seeing it kind of evolve into these other art forms, these other digital art forms, such as in VR and immersive entertainment, and where that kind of is heading. And let me give you some specific examples of what I mean by this. We've recently seen Nintendo have actually created escape room experiences for some of their more well-known brands, which I won't name, which is coming to the US in the next year. We've seen the emergence of various VR experiences that are based upon things like Batman, as a for example, traditional comic book characters, and we're seeing this real kind of resurgence of just kind of borrowing from what was traditionally a very 2D art form into these more immersive art forms. And I'm curious, and I'm going to start with you. Ian, just because obviously you've kind of lived through this process with franchises such as Tomb Raider and seeing it go through that evolution. I'm curious from your perspective how you see this kind of progression of the art forms into immersive entertainment and what your sentiment is about this kind of fusion of technology with storytelling.
I think that the most wonderful thing about the games industry is really it's platform agnostic. I mean, technology drives innovation in the medium like no other entertainment medium. And formats that didn't exist a few years ago become major platforms for content to reach new audiences. So, of course, we've had Facebook became a huge platform for games. Smartphones became a huge platform. We're now seeing how popular VR is becoming. We've seen a glimpse of AR with Pokemon Go, that how the world became obsessed and running around the world chasing their Pokemon. And with that next call, we're going talking about mixed reality. So, game is a pervasive medium, and it's evolving constantly. And it's just, for a content creator, it doesn't really matter what platform's the platform of the day, because they can migrate their content to that platform. So games will always be at the forefront of entertainment, and whether they source their material from comics or novels or original material, it's such an exciting medium because of the graphics meeting technology. It's the fusion of art and science, and because it's interactive, giving power to the player the way the Final Fantasy gave power to the reader. It's all about them rather than following the linear narrative prescribed by the director. That you take control. It's always going to be more compelling entertainment than any other entertainment, in my opinion.
So, kind of just following on from that, then, if we think about this, and in some ways, the real advantage here is that, as you said, that idea of kind of giving the control back to the user and the freedom to be able to kind of craft the universe around you as the user. I'm curious to hear from you, Paul, in terms of your thoughts on the future of the kind of linear storytelling industries. And by that, I mean traditional movies in Hollywood, in that we're starting to see not just a shift in the desire to be able to control the story, but the shift in the desire to control the way that one consumes that entertainment. And we see that most predominantly in things like Amazon and Netflix and, various over-the-top services and streaming, which has completely destabilized the way that people think about traditional, movie making. And I'm curious from your perspective, how you see that evolution progressing.
Well, so for us, we believe in entertainment across the board. And we think of it as a kind of transmedia experience, and that for the right titles, having a kind of transmedia multifaceted approach works and makes sense. We just this week, actually, we shot something that we think is quite on the bleeding edge, which is we have a VR project with Legion M called Icons Face to Face. And our goal, it's a virtual reality interview series. And our goal is with virtual reality to replicate as close as technically possible the experience of being in a room for an intimate conversation with icons of our generation. As we know, 2016 was a horrendous year. We lost a lot of icons. And this year is, already off to a bad start. And we want to preserve these moments and these experiences. And what's interesting is just in the last 4 months, we have now the technology to capture it. We don't yet have the technology to view it, as you can tell from, any of the virtual reality goggles and experiences that you've tried to date. They're wonderfully immersive from being able to look around in all the possible directions, but the resolution is still really poor because what you're doing is you're spreading your resolution across, a wider field. And so, but for this experience, and we chose, so our goal with these interviews is to have a library of interviews. And our first subject was Stan Lee, who's a, absolutely massive icon of our generation, one of the greatest storytellers, and also 94 years old, and still very energized and very interesting and engaging. And so we let the interview subject choose who they want to interview them, because we want it to be an intimate conversation. We shot it in Stan Lee's home, in his party room. He chose Kevin Smith to interview him. He and Kevin are very good friends. Kevin was able to create this unbelievably intimate conversation with Stan Lee. And we shot it with 2 Red Weapon cameras, 8K, nodal Red Weapon cameras, 8K per camera. And we know that there's no conceivable way to utilize what we caught this week right now. But within 5 years' time, expectation is that we want to get to 70 to 75 pixels per degree, which is actually the resolution of our eyesight. So beyond that, so we can really, and it's not here yet, but it's coming.
It's coming, and it will come a lot quicker than you probably think it will. I mean, the technology is moving so quickly these days. But what I find really interesting about what you're talking about here with your projects is, one of the things that I know about Legion M is that you have a really good rapport with your community. And while Stanley was your first subject, I know that the topic of discussion right now in your community is who are the next subjects going to be. And there's all sorts of different suggestions that are being thrown out by the members of your community. And the difference between you and other studios might be the fact that you will actually listen to them and you will take on board.
First and foremost, and this is like, and because you have visibility into it, you're a part of the Legion, that we are a community before we're a company. And everything we do involves that community. So even before we met with Stan Lee, we solicited our Legion for ideas for questions. So they were very active and provided some amazing good questions that we were able to share with Kevin Smith. And he's like, oh my God, this is kick ass. This is, and so with Kevin Smith and our Legion both kind of collaborating, we were able to, and I think we also had the suggestion that we should include Stan Lee's wife. And we did that. And so not many people realize that Stan Lee's been married almost 70 years. And we had a tear-jerking conversation with Joni, Stan Lee's wife. And it was, it was just a very moving experience. And it was the type of thing that it was because we had this community and all these kind of the ability to collect and gather, all these great ideas. And now, just like you said, we've got the Legion is helping us identify who is the next icon. But one thing I'll say is having a Legion of fans as our investors and our kind of, community, when we go to Stan Lee and ask for this interview, it's a completely different ask than if we were CNN or, the BBC asking for this interview. We're asking as a Legion of his fans. And it's hard for him to, he was very supportive. And so was Kevin Smith, by the way. But you're right. I think, that the community is our superpower. That's the way we see it.
So I'm curious, kind of bearing in mind that what you're talking about is a kind of I'm going to say certainly at the front edge of this evolution of the way that people are beginning to converse with their audiences and engage with their audiences. Andy, I am curious from your perspective, as a more traditional storyteller, as somebody who is on the creative side of that fence, what your sentiment is when you hear about this type of process where actually you have a fandom that are directly communicating their desires and their wishes for the shape and the direction that creative universe is going to take. How does that work for you as the traditional auteur and the controlling voice of the narrative design of how this is going to look?
I actually sort of embrace this kind of thinking. If I take an example, something like Dark Souls 2 comic, which we put together for Bandai, I saw an opportunity to actually engage with the community at the time. There was a competition being run where they had to design their own shield. And it was only a small thing. It didn't really affect the narrative too much. Not at all, really. I mean, it was just a case where I could suggest to Bandai that let's put the winner's shield that is designed into the comic. So, not only does that person who wins feels like they've contributed to the comic because they see the character walking around in panels with the shield that they designed, but it actually adds as a wave for PR, because that person then advocates how cool something is to the fans. It just creates an extra wave of PR. Only really increases. And for me, that's a very interesting mechanic, and I have actually proposed a few times to prospective clients to say, look, I want to do a comic where we almost pause the action and either let them choose, and then I'll write the next section onwards as to multiple choices. There still needs to be an element of control, because otherwise, if you give too many options, it can go in so many mad, wild directions. You need that sort of, almost like Ian's sort of example of fighting fantasy. You need those maybe 3 different paths, 4 different paths that how that will sort of pan out. But ultimately, the fans are making the decision, and I actually sort of try to advocate and push that where possible. Unfortunately, nobody's taken it up, so I'm sure it will happen. I'm sure it will happen. I think that's a really neat idea, and I'm always up for trying to involve the community as much as possible, because it only grows. It only increases your presence, and people get engaged in that and actually feel like they're investing in something that they had a hand in, and not just sort of passengers to something. They actually had some sort of control.
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of kind of giving people back a stake in the universe and a direct hand in the outcomes of the story and the narrative. And I think this kind of goes back to the fighting fantasy approach, which, Ian, you must find this rather ironic that you're kind of coming full circle almost, 35 years later. That we are seeing more and more of these trends where people are using things like what we would call ARG, or alternate reality gaming, as a marketing ploy, as a tool to actually drive audiences to get engaged and take an ownership and a stake in that universe. And one of the kind of recent examples of an ARG that was used for a cinematic universe was for the Hunger Games, with the release of Capital.pn, where fans were given the opportunity to become a member of whichever district number it was, and then they petitioned and essentially went on a political campaign to try and become the mayor of each district. And by doing that, they were drawing more fans in to advocate for the actual franchise. But once somebody won that mayorship, they actually became part of the canon and part of the history and the story of this universe. And so as the movies were being created, people could point to things and kind of say, what, that was me. I did that. And that's an interesting process that we're seeing that reemerge, that decision-making process that directly is put into the hands of the fans and the audience. And I'm curious from your perspective, Ian, now that you're seeing this almost kind of coming back around, what you see as an interesting progression from not just choosing the direction of the story and kind of the outcome, but choosing specific elements of that fandom or that universe and being able to kind of give that back to the fans. What's your sentiment on that?
Well, I think it's fantastic that community has become a part of everything, especially around games. And, in terms of games design as well, you've got to give voice to the community to make sure the game is what they expect. I mean, the primacy of the game's designer is over. You can no longer live in an ivory tower, and he or she has to accept the wisdom of the crowds that they will always know what they want is better. And if you can give the crowds a piece of some sort of ownership or a sense of belonging and being part of the whatever it is you're creating, so much for better for both you and them. And when I wrote my last Final Fantasy game book, Blood of the Zombies, 5 years ago, I used Twitter to get more engaged with the users, because I originally wrote them for 10-year-olds, and now I was writing them for 40-year-olds masquerading as 10-year-olds. So I need to know what kind of book they wanted, what level they wanted it, and so I let them name the book rather than me naming it. I gave them choices of naming the book. I let them name the places. They had places in the book in Blood of the Zombies were named after some of the people who tweeted in, and so it was great to have an interaction with the audience, and I'm sure they enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. It gives a much better sense of belonging and gives authenticity to the whole thing, which is great.
So I think there are probably a lot of writers and storytellers in more traditional areas, such as in filmmaking, who may feel a certain degree of fear with this notion of handing off control or sharing control, shall we say, with the audience. And I think that's particularly so in terms of people like directors, where they very much control the frame. They control the story as you see it. And I'm curious from your perspective how we share the lessons that we have learnt in the games industry with those traditional auteurs who might have that slight control issue.
Well, I think that the best thing, why the games industry is growing at such a rate, you're now talking about $100 billion a year revenues in a global market, which is extraordinary. And it is because you're giving control to the user. A film is a linear narrative, and it's controlled by the director, where it's effectively running on rails, and you may or may not like where that's going. But with a game, it's the player who controls the action, and therefore that's bound to be more compelling. So whether it's Final Fantasy or interactive computer game, taking control is all about you rather than all about the director. So I think film has got a lot to learn about that. We're hearing about interactive storylines coming into films. I'm sure you're going to see a lot more fusion of the two mediums, as some games are more cinematic and some films want to have more interactive content in them.
I think that we are coming to an interesting fusion point with that when we talk about the evolution of narrative storytelling and writing for VR, which does kind of tend to borrow from both of these areas and indeed other areas as well to create this new form of storytelling. And I'm interested from your perspective, Paul. I know that you're working on a couple of VR projects and you've already got one on your slate. What's your perspective on this in terms of how much education do you think needs to happen for these types of creative narrative storylines to be able to emerge without there being too much of this push and pull over control and who has control of the narrative, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, there are a couple things. So first, just on the last subject with regard to community involvement and creators. We're very clear with our community that great art isn't created by committee, and everybody knows that. Now, there are opportunities for the collaboration to really be beneficial, but ultimately we don't want to interfere with the creator's creative process, and we want to get behind them and be supportive. And so we put the decision in the creator's hands of when and where and how do they want the community's feedback. No one in our community, ourselves included, get to give it's not like we're soliciting notes for the director across our, legion of people. But as far as VR, one of the things that, for me, having seen some of the, narrative VR and experiencing a lot of that, I think games are fantastic, and they work almost seamlessly over to VR, because we've already kind of been having that similar experience where it's an individual's experience, right? Where you're in this environment, you're experiencing this, and now you can experience it on a more immersive level.
Mm-hmm.
I think where the challenges are for creating a storyline and trying to offer like a narrative or a fictional storytelling experience where I'm going to sit down and say, watch either a short episode or a movie or something like that.
Mm.
That's not gamified. It's just, I'm experiencing an episode in virtual reality. I think this gets really hard.
Mm.
And where I think some of the things that are still being worked out is how do you direct the user's attention? Because when we watch a movie on a big screen or on our television, the director has complete control over what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
It's always looking in the same spot. They use close-ups. There's a lot of cutting. They can use all those elements to tell that story. But when you're in a VR experience, some of those go away, or you have to find the right balance between, giving the user the experience of feeling like they're there and not, having it overly edited and produced.
Indeed. But one thing I will say is whilst we lose some options that cinematic, film producers and directors may be used to, we do gain other techniques that maybe theatre and immersive theatre have been using for quite some time. So I think there's kind of swings and roundabouts in as much as there are some things that we lose, but others that we gain, and there are interesting ways that we can still continue to frame the content, but perhaps utilising slightly different techniques. And in fact, this brings us back round to comics, because of course comic book writers are extremely good at being able to visualise in a more 360 environment, because they're used to this idea of paneling and trying to frame the story in the context of there is this whole activity that's going on, but we just want to tell the story within that individual panel. And what we found a lot of is that actually comic book writers and artists visualizing stories and framing stories for VR has actually been incredibly interesting, and watching them go through that process, and they tend to be quite good at that process. I know that's something that Andy and I have commented on before when we've been talking about the VR Writers Room. I'm curious to hear from you all though, because as you know, we like to ask you one of these broad sweeping questions that's almost impossible to answer, but we're going to ask you to answer it anyway. And this time, what I want to do is I want to ask you what you think is that significant change that is going to happen, be that a cultural shift or a technological advancement that is going to change the way that you interact with storytelling and narrative. And I'm being pretty specific about that because I'm curious to understand how this is going to impact you within your individual sectors. And I am going to start with you, Paul, because you have been on the show most.
Okay. All right. I'm put on the spot here. But, for me, just keeping in the context of the virtual reality discussion that we've been having, we're huge believers in virtual, but we're not ready to bet the farm on it. And part of that is because it still has a long way to go. And I think one of the challenges there, and the thing that I referred to earlier, which I think will, for us, and for most people experiencing it, there's the wonder and the wow factor of having the more immersive experience. Mm-hmm. But I think it's unfortunately contradicted with taking a step back with regard to resolution. And we've all gotten really spoiled with our HD and 4K televisions and Retina, screen phones. And so when we see this, where we can actually see the pixels, which is the way, VR is today, it really reminds you how virtual this reality is. And so I think for me, the big transformation is going to come when it's as high a resolution as a 4K television. And that's when, I think it'll really be quite powerful. And not to take anything away from where it is today. It's come a long way, and it's gotten there, and there's some amazing experiences out there, but I think that's going to be, next level. When we reach that point, that's when, you'll find things really take off.
Okay. So, Andy, What's your thoughts on this?
I think as a writer, I think we're going to have to train up into different skills, and I think we're going to have to change the way that we approach writing. I mean, from a comic book perspective, we're very progressive, we're very, very linear with our writing. You get to a point, progressive, because you finish an issue and then you've got to wait for the next issue. You've got to read all of that before you start the next issue. I think in terms of VR, I think we're going to have to start thinking about emergent writing. And as a comic book writer, it's going to be a case of, writing what happens if this character does this, but if this character does that, there's a separate narrative to write. I can see a dual writing sort of skill that's going to be needed, and a change in the way that we approach comics.
Interesting that you say this, because that almost leads to the idea of kind of a fused role between game design and writing, because that's almost where that's going in terms of being able to map those multiple choices and those multiple options for interaction.
Yeah.
So that could be an interesting new type of role that we see emerging.
Hopefully.
Ian, I'm curious to hear from you as to what your thoughts might be on this.
Well, the way I write my game books really hasn't changed at all since the 1980s. So I suppose from that respect, you could say I've been a Luddite. I still do it manually, create a flow chart, and I don't use software at all to write my books. It's a very old school way of doing things. Meanwhile, the world is being transformed around me monumentally on a daily basis by advances in technology. And I embrace that. And I can see the games industry being more and more transformed by artificial intelligence, like everywhere, as we move away from commodities more into IP-based businesses. And you can see jobs being taken over by robots and artificial intelligence. And I think that'll probably happen in the games industry too. But it's very difficult to see beyond the next couple of years, I would say. But what I do know is that the games industry will always be at the forefront of change, because it's nothing more dynamic than games industry, which goes way beyond entertainment, might I add. Whether it's used in simulation software and education or learning, these are very exciting times for the industry to kind of throw back and throw off its unjustified negative sentiments being often portrayed in the mass media, and embrace all that is good about games, from problem solving in kids to being able to fail in a safe environment, and to use in training pilots and surgeons and the like, and use games-based learning to add some authenticity in the classroom. I think there's incredible opportunities for games to be used in a more educational sense.
Indeed, and I think that in some ways the games industry is kind of going through that evolution of petulant child and teenager, moody teenager, into a slightly more mature kind of adult role, with that recognition of the ways that it can be utilised in other sectors, be that, military, medical, real estate, education, whatever the thing may be. Because I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing so much application for VR in non-entertainment verticals, is because there is that maturity of understanding now about the games industry and what it brings to the table. So I'm interested to see where that evolves over the next few years.
Well, just talking about Final Fantasy game books, which I obviously know quite a lot about. Back in the day, people wanted them banned. There was publications saying that because you're interacting with ghouls and demons, clearly you're going to be possessed by the devil. There was petitions, articles written about it. Children are using their imaginations. God forbid that. And yet at the same time, 18 million books were sold, and there was a study done, and it actually increased children's literacy by 18%. So games are very powerful in adding context and empowerment to kids' lives, and the more we appreciate that, I think the more the opportunity to go beyond something like Final Fantasy to using games in a much more positive sense for all of society. Another study done on Horizon, just to finish off, is that older people, they conducted a study. Old people were invited to come into a laboratory and an MRI scan to measure their cognitive activity. And they'd never played games before. They were given a tablet full of games, came back a month later, another MRI, their cognitive activity had increased significantly because they were using this dormant muscle, which was their brain, to solve problems playing games. And the conclusion was, perhaps in the future, we should give these old people a tablet to play on rather than a tablet to swallow for their betterment.
I like it. That's actually a really
good... that's a good one.
Yeah, I like that. Well, as always, gentlemen, we like to ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our lovely listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to. If you would care to share with us what that social media handle of choice is, Andy.
Yes, you can find me on Twitter, which is Andy, ANDI, Ewington, EWINGTON, and obviously with an at the beginning.
Wonderful, thank you. And Paul, what about your good self?
I'm going to give my brand new shining Twitter account. I've got a new one, a personal account that I'm using.
Oh, wow.
It is
exciting.
At Paul, Paul, M. Scanlan, SCANLAN. And just
shiny and new.
Got that one going this weekend. So yeah, shiny and new and ramping. So trying to build a following.
Okay, so all of the suggestions for your next projects should go to that Twitter handle. Okay.
Well, we also have our Legion M Twitter, but
we'll share all of the relevant links for everybody. But Ian, why don't you share with us your social media handle of choice?
Yes, well, we're sticking with Twitter, and it seems to be the popular medium tonight, so I'll go with that.
Peer pressure, you're going with the flow.
Yes, my Twitter handle is at @IAN_Livingstone. That's Livingstone with an E.
Wonderful.
At the end of it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd.
digitaljamsessions.com